Victory. At. C. Americas. Forgotten. Valor. The U.S. Navies. Armed guard. And Americas. Merchant. Seaman. Service. Sacrifice. Success.
I don't know where that's coming from. There's a slug in here somewhere. Well, with that dramatic introduction to the subject for tonight, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Milt Kremer, signalman, World War II veteran, Navy man. You're on.
Thank you and welcome to Holy Trinity, the Armed Guard.
I don't know if yours is turned up.
Can't hear you. Turned it off.
Hmm? You turned it off.
And America's Armed Guard and America's Merchant Seamen. Now before we get started, so that everyone pretty much knows what they're seeing up here, I think I will I'll semaphore the entire alphabet and name it phonetically. The phonetics of today are not the phonetics of yesterday, but yesterday is what we're talking about. So, yesterday's phonetics: Abel, Baker, Charlie, easy, dog. Now that's on either side, depending on how a word ends. If it's ED, it's easier on this side. If it's AD, the D is easier on this side. The flags I have here are not necessarily attached would not necessarily be attached to my arms if I were aboard a ship, because these things would be much longer, but because of height, because I want you to see what's going on, I cut them off so they're going to be part of my arms. We got the dog: Easy, Fox, George, How, Interog, Jig, King, Love, Mike, Negate, Option, Prep or preparation, Q is opposite Y, Q, R, Roger, Sugar, Tear, Uncle, Victor, William, X-ray, Yoke, Zebra. That may help you a little bit. Tonight we're going to be talking about communications, convoy, and I guess that's it. We'll be going through the process of acquainting you with the armed guard, with the communications, and with the convoy we'll talk about later. Of course, I will mention the convoys that I have been in. Goods and troops delivered on time, where they were needed, mostly by American and Allied fighting forces the world over. A mighty task force, the world's greatest delivery system. The Merchant Marine and their protectors, the Armed Guard. Navy gunners manning Navy guns on American ships were sailing the war zone before the United States declared war. First to get in action, these armed guards had more than 200 encounters with submarines, many of them long-fought battles. First in service, they were first in sacrifice. The armed guard has met the enemy oftener on more divergent fronts than any other fighting force. Every ship was its own unique fighting force. They sailed on flagged ships of many nations: Belgium, Brazil, Greece, Italy, China, Norway, Panama, and Poland. During World War I, they sailed on 384 ships. During World War II, they sailed on 6,233 ships. By the way, Humphrey Bogart was a signalman in the Armed Guard in World War I. They died on rusty old freighters, jarred apart by a torpedo, or a tanker in an inferno of flames they choked to death, or were incinerated in oil-covered waters. They starved to death, or died of thirst or laughs in the tropics, or cold or exposure in the Arctic. To serve in the Armed Guard, you had to be of excellent health and have excellent vision, especially night vision. There were no doctors on board the ships they served in. Their number total 144,930. Enlisted men and officers. Signalmen and radiomen made up 15,000 of that group. The rest were gunners' mates, bosun mates, and officers. The Armed Guard and the Merchant Service suffered far more losses for farmer losses in excess to their size. Their losses were greater than in excess to their size. In 1941, the United States had 900 dry cargo ships and 440 tankers. More than 1,700 ships had been lost, but the Maritime Service had delivered 268 million tons of cargo, a total neither the Germans nor the Japanese High Command could believe. Yeah. Back to the scene.
Okay. Let me turn it up a little.
That's right.
I'm slugging that one over there. Now I'll give her that.
I'll do this one.
I have one question. I noticed that when you did the sign for victory and for US, it looked very similar. Is it how your arms are placed or something?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you had two things that went up similar. I don't know.
Testing.
I'll do this.
Okay, let me just read it. Let me read it first. This will help us out. Could we as a nation do it again? We did it before, and we can do it again.
Could we, as a nation, do it again? We did it before, and we can do it again. Now I'll be sending, the first one was just an introductory slow thing, but I'll be sending semaphore and flashing light at about 10 to 15 words a minute. That is the way it is done in the service. And that's about as fast as we send it, either in convoy or in the fleet. They started out as a small, scantily band of men, but by war's end, they became the most highly trained specialists in the armed service. They had to be, because their duties and responsibilities were awesome. On each ship, there was one signalman, one radioman, a bosun mate, and 18 to 20 gunners, depending on the armament. And of course, a commanding officer whose rank was Lieutenant JG, somewhere in that line. Ours was a lieutenant. And besides having to keep himself up to date, he had the gunners to train, and he had the signalman and the radioman to keep. You had to have them keep up with their rigorous training, because they were alone. No matter what happened, they had to take care of it. I entered the Navy in 1942, in early 1942. My boot training was at Bainbridge, Maryland. Anyone ever knows about Bainbridge, Maryland? The early part of the war it was a mud track. It was mud up to your shins and above, and it was really something. There was no such thing as drilling. Most of the drilling we did, marching that is, was in the barracks. But after basic training, I and 134 electricians and electrician wannabes headed toward the University of Kentucky to the electrician school, the Naval Electrician School. Well, we got to Pittsburgh the following morning by train, and our orders changed. Seems they need signalmen more than they needed electricians, so they headed us out to the University of Chicago and the Naval Communications School. Here our schooling consisted of saturation, semaphore, and flashing light, and other related classes. Our daily routine consisted of sitting in a darkened room and a light similar to this up here on the wall, and someone sitting down at a table with a key, sending flashing light, just sending it. We sat there and for weeks we stared at it until it got through. And finally when the light went on up here, we began to understand some of the things they were sending. They were sending about anything that came into their mind, their liberty, whatever happened on their liberty, that sometimes was laughable. We wondered at first why some people laughed and others didn't. Well, we knew that the ones that laughed understood it, and the ones that didn't. So, flashing light in itself can be very difficult. It takes semaphore takes a lot of practice, and more practice. For instance, and our semaphore, we stood outside the gymnasium on the track field, and we stood out there 3 hours every day. 3 hours every morning flashing light, 3 hours every afternoon semaphore. And we stood there and the same thing happened there. We just stared at them until we started to understand it. And we had people living in apartments around it, and they understood every word. They were having a ball. They knew what was going on. They'd come out every afternoon just to see the show and see what the chief petty officers were chief petty officers had done on their liberty. You guys had to be careful what they said, because some of the things they said were. But anyway, it was a lot of fun. And at night in the barracks after dinner at night was when a lot of our practice took place, especially semaphore. We would gather together in groups and just talk to each other in semaphore. We were told, visualize, visualize, visualize. If you couldn't visualize it, you couldn't see it in your head, you couldn't send it. So you go to bed at night, all you did was visualize till you fell asleep. You visualized every character, every semaphore character. And so we would talk together in the barracks, across the barracks, no matter where we were talking in semaphore. One night, the chief got us together and he said to meet in the room where we all sat to study, somewhere besides the barracks. It was a rather large room, and he said, the only way you can get in that room is by semaphore and permission to get in there, and when you get in there, there will be no talking. All conversation was to be nothing but semaphore. So for 2.5 hours, if you wanted to say something, you had these in your hand, or you didn't. Because a lot of it was done without the flags. You sort of waved your hand if you wanted the floor. And that's the way it went. So one night, Chief came in there, he said, I have a great idea. He said, unless you're precise, unless you're sharp, you won't be able to send semaphore, because you can't be halfway there with a signal. You have to be right there. So he says, what we're going to do tonight, we're going to ask each one of you a question, or give each one of you a statement from a magazine or a book or something, a sentence, and you'll send it, not blindfold, but with your eyes closed. So let's try that. I have a story about Franklin Delano Roosevelt that's rather cute. It's a few sentences long, but it's rather humorous. Okay, on.
Franklin Roosevelt who loved the sea made no secret of the fact
Made no secret of fact
that his favorite branch of the service
that the
was the Navy.
Navy.
At one meeting with,
That's a period. At one meeting
with General George C. Marshall,
with General George C. Marshall,
then Army Chief of Staff,
then now that's a mistake, so this is the way we correct it. There's a series of these. Now we go back to the last word sent properly. Let's go back to Army. Army Chief of Staff.
FDR's partiality was so apparent
F D R's, that's an S. Partiality. Was so apparent
that Marshall felt obliged to protest.
that, whoops, getting ahead of myself. That Marshall that Marshall felt obliged. Think I've logged green again. Obliged to protest.
Mr. President, he said,
Mr. President, he said,
please don't refer to the Army.
please don't refer to the Army
As them and the Navy as us.
Navy as them and the Navy as us. Now, you don't know whether I made those mistakes on purpose or I just goofed, right? 50-50. That gives you some idea of the training that we went through, and that went on and on and on for about 4 months. And when we graduated from there, we were sent to Noroton Heights, Connecticut, to Convoy Communications School. Now, there we got some real high-density flag hoist. All convoys are maneuvered by flag hoist. The commodore of the convoy uses flag hoist only to maneuver his ships, depending on whether it's around a storm, through a fog, around a wolf pack, or whatever. that he uses flag hoists to do that. Now, while I was trying to think of how I could explain flag hoist, I decided it was better to see what I had in the basement and build a ship's mast and yard arm. I put a few flags on it so that you could see rather than have to visualize. So I put together a mast and a yard arm. You see it here. Can everyone see it? I'll explain it. The flag, the American flag, always flew up at up the top of the mast when we were in foreign port. In port, 8 o'clock in the morning, the flag went up. Sunset, it went down. Same thing in a foreign port. But in a foreign port, when you're coming into port, you always fly the flag of the port you're going into. It flies as long as you're there, and when you leave the port at a certain point, it comes down. The American flag stays up there for the rest of that day, but from then on, at sea, the flag flew here, at the foretop. So that's a Canadian flag. Now, the flag you see here is the identifying international flag signal for the Colorado. That's the tanker I was on, the Texaco tanker I was on for 21 months. King, Baker, Fox, second repeater. It repeats the second flag down, Fox. So the call was King, Fox, Baker, Fox. All ships have international call signs, including Navy ships, but they do not start with the letter with King. They start with an N, N for Navy, naval. I have two signals up, Negate Charlie and Victor Charlie. Negate Charlie is a merchant marine distress signal, as is the answer. Negate Charlie means I am in deep distress and I require assistance immediately. So the ship that sees it, that they're sending it to, obviously they wouldn't put it up unless there's another ship around. This ship, Victor Charlie, means I have seen your distress signal and I will see that you get immediate assistance. That's what that means. There were quite a number of single flag meanings. When one single flag went up, you knew exactly what was happening. The Baker flag, for instance, now that's down, it should be all the way up, but because of the size of the flags, that should be all the way up. And it's, when the Baker flag flies, that means you're handling ammunition, you're on a firing range, or you're shifting ammunition.
Taking on fuel.
What's that?
Taking on fuel.
Taking on fuel, that's another one, thank you, yes. I called a few people I didn't remember them all the meanings to the single flag, so I called a few people to help me out here, and that's right, taking on fuel. This one here is a special Navy flag. It's called the SOPAS flag. That doesn't mean, fellas, your deodorant slip hit the showers. That means senior officer present aboard. Senior officer, whether it be the commander of a battle force, a squadron, a division, or whatever. If he is on board, you can either go visit him, send him know that it's all right to send him a message or whatever. When that comes down, you know he's gone ashore, or he's not on board the ship. That's what that single flag means. Now, the A flag, or the able flag, was affirmative. It answered a question. Am I allowed to do this? And that flag went up, affirmative. That means yes, you can do it. Yes, you have my permission. That usually comes from a Commodore, not a Commodore, that's only a Navy meaning. The only flag, single flag that flew on a merchant ship during the war, as I understand it, was the H flag. Now when that H flag flies, whether it's in a fleet ship or whether it's in a merchant ship, it means that I have a pilot on board. Those of you who have gone on cruises have seen that flying. As long as that flag is flying, the pilot is on board, and And when he takes one step into the pilot boat from the ship, down it comes. He's gone. The Baker flag I've told you about. The H flag is the pilot. The I flag, interlog, ask a question. Ask a question. The K flag, of course, king means go ahead in any kind of signal, whether it's flashing light or whether it's semaphore. And a Roger, of course, means I have received your message and will act on it. Queen is a quarantine flag. If the ship for any reason is in quarantine, that flag flies as long as the ship is in quarantine. And you don't usually see that unless the ship is in port. And the only reason it would be in quarantine would be for diseases of some kind brought back, or they've come from a country that has problems health-wise, and it remains in quarantine until the port directors sort it out, and then it comes down. Never missed it. You have one. The one you see underneath my flag hoist here is prep or preparation. That is prepare. That means when that is above a signal, that means prepare to carry out any of the messages that show up on the flag hoist. Now, flag hoist, when you have flag hoist, when the flag hoist comes from another ship or another commander, you have a spotter, you have someone that's bending on flags, you have someone that's holding them up, and you have someone that's writing down the flags in the order. Now, each side of the flag bag, each side of the mast contains 3 halyards, signal halyards, and each 3 halyards has its own separate flag bag. One single alphabetical grouping of flags and numerals, 1 to 0. The flags come out this way, with their one behind the other. You have the signal halyard is much like your own flag halyard at home. If you have a flagpole, there's a clip on it to fasten to the flag. Now, the one end of the flag has a ring on it, and the other side has the clip. Excuse me. And as the spotter spots these flags coming out of the flag bag, he snaps it to the ring. Of course, when this end comes out, it has the hook ready to go on the ring of the next flag. And therefore, the trick is to see this color coming out of the flag bag and be the first one with that thing up the halyard. The men I trained at my signal bridge, I trained them to see that about that much of the flag coming out of the flag bag. And they had to bend on the flag as soon as it was spotted coming out of that flag bag. Prep, boom, up it went. As soon you were doing this rather than hesitating each flag going up the halyard. This is known as knowing your stuff. It's known as proficiency, and once in a while you heard about it for being much too smart because you beat the guy up the halyard that was sending it. I heard about that a few times. So that is flag hoist. There were other things that we learned at Convoy Communication School. We learned zigzag procedures. When there's a danger of a wolf pack hitting a convoy, there are certain zigzag procedures that have to be followed, and that is in your convoy orders. Everything down to the course and speed you have to follow during zigzag. Imagine 200 ships out there and they say zigzag. You better zig before someone zags and you've had it. So you had to follow them very closely, so it was on zigzag orders, verbal talk procedures, that is, every man on board the ship, wore headphones. Whether he was on the bridge, whether he was on the bow watch, the stern, or whether he was in the engine room, they wore headphones. Headphones went to the bridge. That was the only time you could talk. If you had something to say or report to the bridge, you could not back the breeze with anybody else on those headphones. It was strictly to the bridge. And you couldn't tie the headphones up if someone saw something out on the horizon or even closer. You had to be able to report to the bridge so action could be taken, whether it was a problem in the engine room or wherever. So, there was high-frequency radio talk, and general convoy operations, we learned about those, and merchant ship commands. And that was pretty much what happened up there. And of course, there was that flashing light and semaphore that you had to keep right on going with, because semaphore wasn't used all that much in any of the convoys that I was in. Mostly it was flashing light and flag hoist. They were the two main, the most important, of course, being flag hoist. Now, when we graduated from up there, we were sent from there to Brooklyn, the Armed Guard Center in Brooklyn. Everyone who was put on board a ship on the East Coast was sent to Brooklyn, New York, the Armed Guard Center. And you stayed there until, you had no duty, you stayed there until you were assigned to a ship. Well, I lasted 3 days. My ship was ready in New York, near the George Washington Bridge. She was anchored out in the middle of the stream, all ready to go. We had, the ship itself carried 166,000 barrels of oil plus its own fuel. It was a brand new ship. She was built about 18 months before I got on board her, as was 4 or 5 others, or maybe 6 others that Texaco had built for peacetime. These were built in peacetime. And she had a battleship bow and twin screws. It could do 22 knots or 23¼ miles per hour loaded. Now, what we did when we loaded, we loaded our planes. We loaded our planes in New York. We had planes that we took over. That's how the planes didn't fly over there, the fighter planes. They were taken over there on tankers for the most part. We had spar decks that were fastened to the well deck, between the bow and the midships housing, and between the midships housing and the rear deck housing. The planes were the engines for 4 or 5 planes were battened down forward, and the fuselages between the two housings, the midships and the rear deck. And we loaded them in New York. From New York, we went to Aruba or Curacao to pick up our cargo, and from there we went to Port of Spain, Trinidad, inside the submarine nets with a lot of other ships waiting there for a convoy to form. And when the ships arrived, and rather still when the Commodore arrived, and ordered the convoy to sea, they formed the convoy immediately upon leaving Port of Spain. The sailing orders issued by the Commodore of the convoy to all ships' captains and their armed guard officers were as follows. There shall be no surrender or abandoning ship so long as the guns can be fired, and any chance the ship can be saved. The armed guard will remain thereon. Equally, the master's orders to abandon ship do not apply to the armed guard, who were to remain on board until their commanding officer told them to abandon ship. And these orders had very broad implications. One very humorous broad implication is this: a young recruit who was to go into the Radio Shack, his first Radio Shack aboard the ship, asked the chief signalman just how that applied to him. How long should he stay at his post? You can imagine what the chief signalman said. He said, until the water is up to your eyeballs and the barracudas are nibbling at your butt. So, I guess that gives you a pretty good idea. There were several instances that I have read about and I've heard about where the armed guard gunners did stay at their posts until they were almost hip deep in water and firing their guns. You gotta give these guys a lot of credit. Without the gunners, we'd have been nowhere. They were a gutsy group. And we were very lucky to remain on the Colorado for 21 months together. Very rarely do armed guardsmen remain on a ship more than a year. They're either transferred to another ship, given the leave and transferred to another ship, or sent back to the armed guard center and then given another ship, or they request another ship. That works too. Well, it did if there was room and you could get to another ship and someone take your place. But it was unusual. We did not lose a member of our crew, armed guard or merchant, in the whole 21 months I was with the Colorado. And you can imagine we were quite an ocean-going family by the time the war was over and we were finally transferred. To get back to communications, convoy communications took many varied and secretive and restricted forms, always with the safety of the convoy uppermost at all times. Now there were other than semaphore, flashing light, flag hoist, and then there was the incoming radio signals. No radio signals were allowed to be sent out by the ship. Every sub in the world could know where you were allowed if you sent that out. The only thing that came into the ship was through the radio, and there was two different forms. One was BAMS. It was BAMS, British American Merchant Signals. These came out of Long Island, New York, and out of Norfolk. They were sent out at 500 kilocycles, a very, very weak signal. By the time the convoy or the ships got halfway to where they were going, on the ocean, that those signals were so weak they could no longer be heard. So, at certain particular times of the day that were designated in the convoy orders, there was another one, Fox. Fox was sent out from Washington, from London, and from Reykjavik, Iceland, to the ships bound for Murmansk and Archangel, and in Russia. And these Fox signals were sent at of course, Morse, and this is sound, 25 words a minute normally. I spent a lot of time in the Radio Shack just sitting and listening to that, to improve my proficiency in flashing light. And I got to the point where I could read that. Well, when you get to just jump ahead a little bit, when you dots and dashes, you can't, once you get to know the code well enough and you can read it up to 10 words a minute, you're not reading dots and dashes. We were told that, didn't believe it, but we were told it. You're not reading the dots and the dashes, you're reading the intervals between the dots and the dashes. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? But that's what you were actually doing, the intervals between the dots and the dashes. My top speed was 22 words a minute, almost a constant blur. But I didn't attain that until I was about in my third or fourth year. But in the meantime, we did a lot of practicing and batting the breeze at sea and wherever with flashing light also. So it was a constant thing to keep improving yourself, to keep it up, because you were alone out there. You were absolutely responsible for every signal that came and left the ship. You had the safety, you had the whole safety of the ship and its crew at your fingertips, and you had to be right. The radar was our eyes on the surface, sonar was our ears under the surface. As I said before, we had people on watch all over the ship to keep a watch. Some kept a watch from the bow watch kept their watch from the bow to midships on both sides. The bridge, of course, looked all over the place. The stern watch kept their watch from the stern to midships and out. That way, all 360 degrees of that ship was taken care of. Now, after the convoy orders were issued, the Coloradoans and all convoys we participated in. Of course, I told you we loaded our planes in New York. We went down to Port of Spain. We carried P-47s and P-51s. We delivered altogether in the 6 convoys the Colorado was sailed in. Carried 36 planes over to Liverpool, England. Not all ships went to Liverpool. We did. We unloaded our planes on lighters in Liverpool Harbor, and then proceeded up the inland waterway to Ellesmere Port, England, where to a refinery where we dumped our cargo. And for the next 5 or 6 days after the cargo was out, we had the gas free, because a ship is more dangerous without the cargo than with it. It's like putting a match to dynamite. All it took was a spark to set it off, and most of the tools that these people used on board the ship to work on deck were rubber covered. And they had to be very careful not to make a spark. When we had a few days liberty either in Liverpool or in Chester, England nearby, we returned alone to New York. We traveled down the South Atlantic. We normally went to England Europe in the North Atlantic. We returned by the South Atlantic around the Azores, back to New York. Did the same thing all over again, and the process was repeated six times.
Mind a question?
Yes,
Normal position of your flotilla, what number of ships would it be in, and where were you, on the end of it? And also the armament what aboard?
yeah, good. I'm getting to that. Thank you.
All right.
The formation of the convoy was like this. Convoys consisted of the number of ships from up to 200 ships, horizon to horizon and over the horizon. They covered many hundreds of square miles, depending on the size of the convoy. And the way they lined up, they lined up with the ships on the port side of the convoy, lined up in lines which were 500 feet fore and aft, 1,000 feet starboard to port. That is roughly the position you had to maintain in convoy. And in a storm, or when there was danger, that was rather difficult. But roughly, you had to maintain that distance for safety. And the ships on the port side that lined up on the port side were the ones that normally went to Russia, the northern ports of Russia, Murmansk and Archangel. When they got to a particular place in the ocean, they were ordered to peel off. They peeled off, and off they went to Iceland to form a convoy to go north. Ships on the starboard side, they were the ones that were designated for North Africa and the Mediterranean. Ships in the middle, England, and the rest of Europe. Normally just England. The Commodore himself was always, unlike the British, the Commodore was on a convoy ship. The British is always on a ship of war. And it's usually the Commodore usually is a commander or above. in one of the admiral ranks, not the top admiral rank. The top admiral rank are the ones that give the orders, but normally, you'd find a convoy the size of maybe 200 ships. You have a vice or a rear admiral there taking care of it. And his ship was the center ship up front, always the center ship up front. Now, as soon as the convoy was formed, he put up a signal that meant everybody put your international code, your international call sign up, and up they would go, and he would check them to see that you were in the right position. Well, the Colorado got out there one time in the wrong position, and we got called on it. Imagine a tanker in the center of a convoy that included troop ships, freighters, what have you. Normally, ammunition ships and tankers are at the extreme back part of the convoy or on the sides, never in the middle or in any way, whether it's in the dead center of the convoy or whether it's dead center of one of the lines. Tankers and ammunition ships belong back on the port of the starboard quarter or the back line. And so the Commodore got on us one time. After all those other hoists came down that were correct, ours went back up again. So you have to answer your flag hoist exactly. What he puts up, you put up. So he knows that you're right, and he knows that the right ship is answering. And this is what went on between the Commodore and the Colorado.
If there is honor or integrity.
No.
Oops. The Colorado. Number 7. Colorado quarter back there.
Okay, we got it. So the Commodore sends the flashing light. We'll do it this way.
From the Commodore, what is your position?
What is, I'm gonna get cute, you are, position, we did that a lot.
Colorado, convoy's plan puts us here.
Convoy, plan, put us here.
Commodore, our error.
Our, you know what that means, don't you?
Sorry,
I don't know how to spell R anymore. Oh, you are. Error. Sorry,
please change position.
please. You threw me for a loop there. Change, posit, P-O-S-I-T means position.
With ship 47,
With ship 4, 7.
good luck.
And we needed it. It took us about 4.5 hours to just drop back, stop our engines and drop back. And the other ship sort of skirted around us and got into position by going around the lines and coming in. But we dropped all the way back, and our position ended up to be the last ship on the port quarter We got there about 4 hours later, it was about 6 o'clock at night. There was one submarine out there, we found this out later. There was one submarine out there, he had one torpedo left. He spotted the convoy, it was a 100-ship convoy. He spotted this convoy just before dusk, and he thought, well, I'm gonna shoot and get out of here. This is one convoy where we had some escorts. Now that might sound funny, but a lot of convoys that went out had few escorts. About the middle of the war, we began to get escorts to escort us on our complete convoy. But we had some DEs, we had a cruiser, and we had a dirigible. That was our first convoy out of New York to the lightship, one dirigible. But anyway, this guy figured he couldn't miss. So he fired, turned tail and left. But you can't guess what ship he hit. He hit number 47. He hit the one in the middle of the convoy that we changed places with. That ship, that convoy was going 12 knots at the time. And it was dark, or almost dark. Now the people that were fore and after that ship, and starboard to port of that ship, swears that that ship must have imploded. That means the bottom was blown out. And instead of a big explosion, or instead of the ship going down by the stern or by the head, she went straight down. Everybody, including the crew and the ship and the cargo, was lost. Not one person got off that ship. Not only that, that ship had 60-foot masts on it. And she went down so fast that the ship astern of it went over her without hitting the mast, and she was 30 feet in the water. We didn't find out about that until we got to England. I would say somebody was with us that day. The Commodore. He told us to get out of there. Now, after our Colorado, after its 6 convoys in Europe, we were a fast ship, as I said before, and they took all fast ships out of convoy. That ships, I would guess, that went 15 knots or more. We did 22, and they sailed alone. And that means that when you're alone, there's a possibility that the men and the materials or whatever you carry as a cargo will get there faster, so that the people who need it have it quicker when they need it for their use. Well, we were sent on a West African run, as you saw by this map over here. We ran the West African coast from Dakar down to Belgian Congo. We hit about 6 or 7 ports along the way. Most of them Air Force installations that needed high test. We carried mostly high test gasoline. Now the Colorado, if I tell you a little bit about her, she don't look much like a luxury liner on what you see here. But most sailors' first love is his first ship, whether it be a rust bucket or a luxury liner. Well, ours I would consider a luxury liner for this reason. When Texaco gives a master a ship, it's his. And when they gave Captain Stevens the Colorado, he was allowed to appoint it in any way he could. That is the staterooms, fore and aft, his quarters, his wardroom, the crew's quarters. So what he did, he loved mahogany. This guy, for instance, he was an old German sailing ship skipper. He was one of 5 skippers in the world at that time who held master's papers for sail and steam. And he and those 5 skippers, when they knew they were in any particular part of the world, they'd get together and they'd have dinner or what have you. They'd get together because there weren't that many sailing skippers around. And this guy knew his stuff, and he was a father figure and a grandfather figure to most of us. But the ship itself, all its staterooms, fore and aft, were lined in either black or blonde mahogany. Now on several of the trips we were on, he picked up mahogany for his own use in the West African ports. And the stateroom that I was in amidships, the captain's quarters, of course, is forward. The wardroom was down one deck, just above the well deck. And his quarters, of course, was near the bridge and the pilot house. And our quarters, the radio man and I, had large quarters on the starboard side of the ship. We had portholes you could almost pull a truck through. And it was a king size beds. Now these quarters were all made for peacetime and for passengers. And so you might know how beautiful they were. And all facilities, everyone had facilities within their own quarters. You didn't have to go back after the bathroom or coming up around Hatteras. You wouldn't want to try that anyway. But it was very beautifully appointed, fore and aft. Now the gunners and the communications people for the up front armament were all quartered in the midships housing. The armed guard officer had quarters across the hall from us. He had a beautiful room.